This is lecture number 9 for Thursday, May 7th, 2020. And this is the French Revolution class. So we're going to talk about a bunch of things that are going on in the first year of the revolution. So I'm pretty much just going to cover the first year. There's a whole bunch of things and lots of different topics. There's a bunch of stuff going on. And part of this is, if you look at this overall lecture and how sort of disjointed it is and how weird things are just happening, I think it's a good argument for why, in some cases, theory is very helpful, historical theory, because it helps us to organize all these events and figure out what the heck is going on and what's important and what's not, right? As I go through this lecture, I want you to be thinking about the Marxist idea that the revolution is driven by different classes entering the conflict and fighting with each other for their own interests. I want you to think about the post-structuralist argument that it's about language and culture and the structure of ideas and categories we have in our heads that are shaping the actions in the revolution. And I want you to think about the Tackett argument that basically is just sort of a bunch of the result of a bunch of people making decisions, and you really can't find some grand pattern, and it's simply the result of everybody making decisions. So let's talk about the first year then. First of all, one of the interesting things is, beginning with the fall of the Bastille, July 14th, 1789, you start to see a lot of aristocrats actually leaving the country. They're fleeing the country. And it starts at the top, right after the revolution, right after the fall of the Bastille. Some of the grands, some of the biggest names in the aristocracy began to leave, including the king's younger brother, the Comte d'Artois. And they fled to across the border into Germany and often hung out at Frankfurt, or they fled into northern Italy and hung out at Turin. But basically, and sometimes this was accompanied by violence, right? The intendant of Paris, who was an appointee of the king, a guy named Berthier de Sauvigny, he tries to emigrate, but his carriage gets stopped, and the crowds of Paris attack him and his father-in-law, who's also in the carriage, and they kill them both, cut off their heads, and parade them around Paris on pikes. So there's a serious amount of violence, and a lot of aristocrats honestly feared for their lives, and so they're emigrating. But this creates a dynamic, because for a lot of people, if you emigrate, you leave France, you are basically renouncing the revolution. So to see these big aristocrats leaving, it sort of reinforced that this was an anti-aristocratic revolution that was focused on class, right? Because the lower classes weren't leaving and the middle classes weren't leaving. It was just the aristocracy that was leaving. The one exception to that is that there were a significant number of priests, often lower class priests, who left after the nationalization of the church, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But for the rest of the revolution, there will be, every time there's some new outbreak of violence or some new episode that frightens people, you'll see another wave of emigration, right? And of course, the Tackett book is talking about one of the biggest attempts at emigration, which is Louis XVI trying to leave the country. But this is sort of the background, and I just want you to keep in mind this is happening throughout the rest of the revolution. That every time there's another outbreak of violence, a number of people, especially aristocrats and the wealthy, will leave France, and this sort of reinforces the idea in a lot of people's minds that the upper classes are not loyal to France. Okay, second big thing I want to talk about is the Great Fear, because essentially, the Bastille happens, right? The National Assembly declares itself, and then the fall of the Bastille, and there's violence, and then the king sort of gives in and says, okay, the National Assembly can stay. This set off a whole rumor mill, and again, I want to make it clear that there are not, at this point, there is no reliable way to get information, right? There are newspapers, but they're wildly vary in quality and trustability. And so for a lot of people, rumor is the way they get their news. And so the fall of the Bastille sets off rumors everywhere. And in particular, one of the things is that for peasants who are outside of Paris, they're hearing these rumors. They have no idea what to make of all this, right? They don't know who the factions are. They don't know who the leaders are. They don't understand. They don't have a class-based understanding. So they're really going, what's going on? I don't understand. And so peasants tended to translate this into terms that they could understand. And for peasants, the biggest, the urban middle class was sort of, peasants simply didn't have much experience with them, right? Peasants didn't talk to lawyers. Peasants didn't deal with doctors. Peasants didn't deal with merchants or artisans, or etc. But they did deal with aristocrats. And so the peasants understood this as the fall of the Bastille as essentially some sort of insult to the aristocrats. And so immediately you began to hear rumors swirling around that the aristocrats were angry at the peasants and they were going to take the revenge on the peasants, right? I also want to point out peasants had very little concept of a split between aristocrats and the king. They thought of them all as just being the elites, and they didn't think there would be any sort of conflict between the king and his aristocrats. So essentially, the assumption was that they hear rumors that the fall of the Bastille, etc., and then they hear rumors that aristocrats are leaving the country, and they immediately assume that the aristocrats now hate the revolution and are going to attack the revolution. And for peasants, they translated this into what they could understand. And what you see happen then is two things happen in late July and August. And the two things, because they happen at the same time, seem to be related. But I'll talk about it in a minute, they might not be. The first thing is, there are all sorts of rumors that begin to swirl throughout France that the aristocrats, whoever that is, just the aristocrats, have hired armies of brigands, right? And these armies of brigands are going to travel around France, and they're going to punish the people of France for the fall of the Bastille and for the National Assembly. And for peasants, how would somebody punish them? Well, they would attack their fields. And so the assumption was that these armies of brigands are going to march around, they're going to burn down peasants' fields, they're going to destroy their livestock, they're going to, do whatever they can to hurt the peasants. And so these fears of armies of brigands just spread across France. And you can see that, you can actually trace it in letters and things like that. You can watch where the fear travels as people get, they get this rumor and they start to get afraid. And the result of this was that in many villages, especially in southern France, what you saw was that people would get together and they'd say, oh my gosh, maybe there's an army of brigands coming. And they would put together a militia. They would arm themselves with whatever they had. And they would go out and they would patrol their fields and march around their fields, making sure there was no brigands coming to burn down their fields. And remember, this is July and August. We're getting towards the end, towards harvest, and so the peasants are really worried about if something happens to their crops now, they can't replant or anything like that. But what's interesting is it seems pretty clear, if you look at the records, that one village would put together a militia and they'd go out and march around their fields and look for brigands. And the next village over would report that somebody saw brigands, an army of brigands in the distance, and so that village would organize a militia and start marching, patrolling their fields, because they knew there were brigands out there somewhere. And then when that village did that, the next village over would say, oh, we saw armies of brigands. So it's pretty clear what's happening is you have these rumors and everybody is getting suspicious of everybody and expecting armies of brigands. And then they see the militia from the next town over in the distance, and they think it's an army of brigands, and so they form their own militia. So there's this sort of panic that spreads across the countryside, and historians call this the Great Fear. That portion of the Great Fear really didn't have too big of a long-term impact. It just reflects the mentality of the peasants, that they're terrified, they don't quite understand what had happened at Versailles and in Paris with the fall of the Bastille and the National Assembly, but they understand that this was somehow a setback for the elites, and so they're expecting retaliation from the elites, and the only form of retaliation they could think of would be burning down the crops and what have you. So the peasants are sort of expressing their worldview through this. But there's another part of the Great Fear, and that is that there's lots of places across France where you would suddenly see the peasants would get together and they would get angry at their lord, and they might be worried that the lord was going to retaliate against them, and so they decided to go on the offensive. And they actually would put together a group of peasants would actually march to the lord's house, the chateau, and they would destroy anything that seemed to smack of the lord's privileges, wine presses or dovecotes or anything that seemed to be a source of privilege. And they would often they had a very specific target. They often would break into the chateaus and try to find the records of seigneurial dues, because if they could find the record books that said this peasant owes this much in rent, or this peasant owes this much in seigneurial dues, and they could burn that, then the lord has no way to prove that the peasant owes any seigneurial dues. And so peasants often, their main target was to break into the lord's houses and find these records and burn all the papers, right? And often these peasants are not very literate, so they're just burning all the papers, right? Because for them, a written document, because they can't really read it or engage with it, a written document is a sign of the oppression of the ruling classes, because the ruling classes tell them, hey, it's written here, you have to do it. And so for peasants, attacking those written documents is a way to get away from seigneurial dues or any kind of oppression. Often there was resistance, and it was not uncommon to have these crowds turn to violence, and often you had cases of lords being attacked, or the retainers and servants of the lord being attacked and killed. Occasionally you had peasants breaking into the chateaus and raping the wives or daughters of lords, and then killing sons or the lords or whatever. And you often saw it in cities too. The smaller cities in, say, northern France had moments where nervous crowds would gather, and they would attack any representation of aristocracy or the monarchy. And so you occasionally have soldiers in a town, a small garrison in a town would be attacked, and the soldiers would be killed and their heads put on pikes and paraded through the town. So the Great Fear really had two parts. The one was this sort of rumors of brigands traveling around, and towns would form militias and go look for brigands and not find any. The other part of the Great Fear was these attacks, direct attacks on noble chateaus and noble holdings. And everybody thought for a long time that because these things were all over the place with peasants, that these were all part of one big Great Fear. But more recent historical research has showed that, in fact, they were almost mutually exclusive, because the places that had rumors of brigands and towns put together militias almost never had attacks on chateaus and violence. But the places that had attacks on chateaus and violence didn't report any rumors of brigand armies before that. And so it seems to be two sort of possible responses that happen in different areas, right? And so it seems like every little region had a choice of two responses, and they picked one. But whatever the case, the Great Fear was it involved all these reports of violence. Even the places where there was no violence, there were reports of brigand armies, and there were frantic reports of, people are coming to get us, etc. And then you had these reports of, there was an attack on this chateau and this lord got killed, or there was an attack on this town and this garrison of soldiers got killed. So in the National Assembly back in Paris, there's all these reports coming in from all over the country in the last 2 weeks of July and the first week and 2 of August, that there's violence everywhere, there's wild attacks, nobody knows what's going on, everybody's got rumors, everybody knows something horrible is happening, and nobody understands what's going on, right? And so in the National Assembly, they didn't know, they were trying to decide, how are we going to respond to this? Right? We should do something. We're in charge now, right? How do we respond to this? And so one of the interesting things that happens on the night of August 4th, an amazing thing happens in the National Assembly. But before that, I want to back up for a second. I want to talk about the fact that the National Assembly, as I mentioned, it's 1,100 people, and it's about a fourth clergy, and as I mentioned before, lower clergy, sort of common parish priests often predominated here. And then it's about a fourth aristocrats, and the really big name aristocrats were common, and then a lot of really bottom level aristocrats were common, and the big aristocrats were leaving, right? And then there's the commons. They're the third estate, and the third estate was about half, right, 600 or so, and the third estate was also had different factions, because a lot of these people thought they were just going to vote on new taxes and that's what they got elected for, and now they suddenly find they're part of a revolution. All right? And so the National Assembly did not have a clear sense of, what are we doing here? Because there were some people who think we shouldn't be doing anything. Some people were like, what am I doing here because I didn't sign up for this? And then other people were like, oh, this is our moment. We're revolutionaries. Let's go. And in particular, there's one group of revolutionaries. They were from Brittany, which is, if you imagine a map of France, and there's that one sort of peninsula that sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean south of England. That's where Brittany is, and the aristocrat, or not the aristocrats, the representatives from Brittany, and if you're from Brittany, you're called a Breton. The representatives from Brittany had sort of gotten into the habit of getting together to talk about what was going on every day after the National Assembly was done, and they began to call themselves the Breton Club, or the club from Brittany. And they actually, a number of the representatives were fairly radical. They really saw this as a revolutionary moment, and so the Breton Club began to form a little clique of people within the National Assembly who were really radical and progressive. They wanted to change things fundamentally. And in particular, they hated aristocratic privileges. Now we're going to keep track of the Breton Club because later we'll see the Breton Club turns into what's called the Jacobins, and that is the sort of core of the most radical portions of the revolution. So we want to keep track of this group. But for right now, it's just a group of deputies called the Breton Club, and they began to actually attract. The core of it was from Brittany, but radical deputies from elsewhere began to say, "Hey, those guys, they've got ideas like mine," and they began to seek them out. And so the Breton Club very quickly expanded to be deputies beyond just Brittany. But in early August, the Breton Club begins to say, you know what? The great fear, when everybody's terrified and we got to do something, and they're attacking aristocrats, this is our moment. We should have the National Assembly get rid of aristocratic privileges. Or we should get rid of as much aristocratic privilege as we can. Strike while the iron is hot. Let's do it now. Now, the National Assembly had this rule that there was a president of the National Assembly who would recognize who gets to speak in what order, and then the president, kind of like the Speaker of the House in the United States House of Representatives, was in charge of when they would vote on different proposals. And so they knew that if they tried to introduce some radical proposal to get rid of aristocratic privileges, on a night when the president of the chamber was a really conservative, nothing would ever come to a vote. Right? And they might not even get to speak much. So they waited until the night of August 4th. It was a Tuesday, and they actually understood that, they knew that by this time, they knew that Tuesdays tend to be sort of down days. Not a lot of the representatives showed up. Some people showed up every night, some people showed up every once in a while, some people showed up some days and not others. That Tuesdays tend to be a very low attendance night. And the Breton Club figured if they could get all of their guys to show up on Tuesday, August 4th, and nobody else showed up, they'd have a better chance of pushing through something that would abolish noble privileges. In addition, on Tuesday, August 4th, one of the members of the Breton Club was scheduled to be the president of the chamber that night. And so they decided that was the place to do it. And so on the night of August 4th, the Breton Club gets ready to propose this radical law to abolish noble privilege. And they had a sort of plan. They had members stand up and propose things and talk about things. They start going through their thing and they start to stand up and propose things. And much to their surprise, some other factions who were not associated with the Breton Club began to stand up and also say, we want to abolish noble privilege also. And in fact, what winds up sort of coming out of this is that there's almost like a competition. The Breton Club stands up and says, we want to abolish, seigneurial dues. And somebody says, well, we want to abolish seigneurial dues and the bans. And somebody else will say, no, we want to abolish, seigneurial dues and bans and hunting privilege. And it sort of turns into this sort of bidding war in a strange way. And then what's kind of interesting is you've got these aristocrats and you've got these clergymen there. And the aristocrats trying to head off this, attack on their privileges are like, yeah, well, if you're going to get rid of aristocratic privileges, you should get rid of the church's privileges too, because they thought nobody would go for that. But then the churchmen stand up and say, well, if you want to get rid of our church privilege for this, then we're going to you should get rid of that aristocratic privilege for that. And so what was originally supposed to be a tactic to sort of deter everybody from going any farther turns out accelerating the process. And the night of August 4th, it actually goes into like 2 or 3 in the morning they have this epic session, and everybody is sort of arguing about what they should get rid of, but it takes on a sort of a momentum, and then it turns into kind of a delirium, and this sort of group, euphoria. They're just like, they're throwing out everything. And they finally vote late in the morning of August 5th, they finally vote to abolish all privileges. Okay. Now, they get up the next morning, and they think about what they did, and they realize that this is not a good idea, that maybe they went a little too far, maybe they got carried away. So what they did then is when they wrote up the actual law, because the process was you would make a proposal by voice, and they'd vote on it, and then somebody had to write it up to actually become law, and then they would vote on that again. Well, they decided to tone it down a little bit, and what they actually said, what they actually wrote up and brought back a few days later to the National Assembly, was a document that said, we're going to change the law so that right now aristocrats by law, have these noble privileges. But if a peasant doesn't want to pay the noble privileges anymore, he can buy the rights to that noble privilege from the Lord. And the Lord has to sell it to him. Well, that's great. It would allow some peasants to buy the noble privileges, something they couldn't do before. But it means in practical purposes, no peasant has the money to do that. And the law explicitly says now that the privileges stay in place until the peasant buys them out. Well, that means that actually nothing happened, or very little happened. And so the actual law from the night of August 4th doesn't do much. But, and here's where the revolution sort of takes on a momentum of its own, the rumor gets out that and in fact, the night of August 4, the rumor gets out what's happened on August 5th, and that rumor travels. But by the time they come back with the actual text of the law to approve it on like August, I forget what it is, the 8th or something like that, the rumor has already been going for 4 days, and it's reached all the way across France. And peasants hear that they don't have to pay seigneurial dues anymore, right? And in fact, what this winds up doing is de facto it does abolish seigneurial privileges, because if the peasants just stop paying it, the lords really can't go after every single one of their peasants all at once, right? So it's kind of like a general strike. If one guy didn't show up for work, you can fire him, but if everybody doesn't show up for work, you can't fire all of them, because then you have no workers. So they can't go after all the peasants. And when all the peasants refuse to pay, it sort of causes the death of seigneurial privilege. And what really happens is, this really is the end of feudal privileges, because some lords would try to enforce it, and they'd get into conflicts with their peasants, etc. And then, the news came out later that the privileges weren't really revoked, but nobody kind of believed it, and it just led to the death of the system. If nobody played that game anymore, the lords couldn't enforce it. It simply fell apart. All right, so that's the first sort of really radical thing that the National Assembly did. It abolished seigneurial dues and noble privileges and the church's privileges. And this was actually an important symbolic point, because what it said was that it was totally normal in the legal system of France before the French Revolution to say, this law applies to this group of people, and this law applies to this group of people. And there was an assumption that the law did not apply equally to everybody. Everybody had their own private laws that applied to them, right? Based on what group they were part of. If you're part of the church, you had one set of laws. If you're part of the aristocracy, you had another set of laws. If you were part of the guild, you had another set of laws. There were all these different groups that had different laws that applied to them. And the night of August 4th was really very symbolic, because they basically said, let's get rid of all the laws that only apply to one group or another group. Well, they took it one step further a little while later. And here again, the Abbé Sieyès had an enormous role here. I've talked about the Abbé Sieyès last time. He was a key player in the move to declare the National Assembly to be the National Assembly. He was a key player in the early National Assembly. Well, he comes back now, and he makes a proposal. He argues that, as the National Assembly now has said, they said, in July that they were going to, or late June actually, that they were going to write a new constitution for France, right? And that's really what they see as their main job, is to write a constitution for France. But Abbé Sieyès comes back now and he says in August, he says, we should, the foundation for any constitution is that we have to lay down a set of rights for every citizen in France, right? And he's basing this in part on documents from the United States, such as there are documents from the state of Virginia, there are documents from the early part of the American Revolution that had laid out a set of individual rights. Now, by this point, they could have read the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, but that had just been passed, and so most of the people in France weren't really aware of, hadn't seen the Bill of Rights. But that was the idea they were heading towards, right? Is we got to enumerate the rights of citizens. And so Abbé Sieyès introduces something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And they really meant it when they said man and citizen. And the word in French, citizen, is also either masculine or feminine. And so it's the rights of man and the male citizens. They really did just apply to men. And I'll talk more about that in a later lecture about gender and the French Revolution. But so Abbé Sieyès introduces the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and the National Assembly votes to approve it and passes it on August 26th, 1789. Now, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen is interesting because it lays out a series of abstract rights that each individual has, right? And that applies equally to everybody in France. Well, everybody male. And so it lays out some abstract rights, but it clearly also, if you look at the language, does not ensure that everybody is going to really be equal. Everybody has the same basic rights, but it clearly also protects differences in property. It protects, it does not declare that everybody has the same political clout. It does not say there's actually going to be total political equality. It just simply says everybody has the same basic rights. And it also emphasizes that everybody owes the government something. It's sort of like a social contract. It says, here's what the government owes you. You have these rights the government has to protect, but you owe the government taxes and military service and things like that. So it's sort of a beginning of a social contract. So this was the second radical thing that the National Assembly did, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, because this is really a formal declaration. It was implied in the night of August 4 that we're going to get rid of privileges and different laws applying to different groups. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen says, note that everybody, male, has all the same rights. Right? And so it basically says a peasant has the same rights as an aristocrat, the churchmen have the same rights as the artisans in the cities. And so this is a fundamental shift in French law. Because before that, French law was built on the idea that each group negotiated their own laws with the king and had their own traditions and their own, etc. This says, no, we're starting over and we're going to have equality for everybody. Everybody's equal before the law. All right, so that was the second radical thing that the National Assembly did. Now, at this time also, the National Assembly is beginning to talk about the Constitution. They're beginning to say, well, what do we want this Constitution to be like? And one of the early models was that basically they were going to look very closely at the English Constitution. Now, the English Constitution wasn't exactly explicitly spelled out, but they liked the English system. And in particular, in this early part of the National Assembly, there's another guy who emerges, the Count de Mirabeau. Emerges as he's a great orator. He gives fantastic speeches, and so he immediately takes on a sort of oversized influence in the National Assembly because he's so good at convincing people of things. Well, Mirabeau basically says, he's very rich, by the way, he's a really fantastically rich aristocrat. Mirabeau basically says he wants something like the English Constitution. And so they start throwing around ideas that, like, what's the king's role here? And they decided, Mirabeau begins to push for the idea that the king should have a veto. That they'll have a National Assembly, and they might even have a two-chamber house, like the House of Lords and the House of Commons in England, and that they might have a bicameral legislature, two houses, but that anything the legislature passes, the king has a veto power to. Mirabeau begins to really push this, and on September 10th it comes up for vote, and the National Assembly actually votes it down. They're like, no, we don't want the king to have a veto, absolute veto power. That gives him too much power. So there's really some fairly radical parts in the National Assembly who are really skeptical of the king's power. Now, we now know, they didn't know it at the time, but we now know that Mirabeau was actually, he was sort of a shady character. He was sort of famous for being a party animal and being a little bit morally a little shady. Well, we now know that at the same time that he was standing up to try to lead the National Assembly in writing the new Constitution, he was actually writing to the king in secret and asking him for a job. And he was offering the king all sorts of advice on what was going on in the National Assembly. So he was actually sort of a double agent, if you will. He was positioning himself in the National Assembly as someone who could stand up to the king, but he's also positioning himself to the king as somebody who could work on the king's behalf. So the National Assembly now is starting to ask questions about what kind of government do we want to come out of this. But the sort of assumption so far is that they're going to keep the king. That the king has to stay, because nobody can really imagine that you wouldn't have a king. The United States had just passed its constitution, was trying out as a republic, but most people assumed that, every other country in Europe had always had a king, so, except for tiny little places like Geneva and Switzerland who didn't have a king. So they just couldn't imagine you wouldn't have a king, right? And so the assumption was the king would be there. Now, during these negotiations, some people, like Alexius, were really radical. Other people said, no, we want the king to have a full veto. Well, during this time, there was actually some negotiation with the king, and Necker, who is still the chief minister, said that the king would be okay with what's called a suspensive veto. And a suspensive veto is where the king can't outright veto a law he doesn't like, but he can delay it. And the proposal put out there was that the king would be able to delay a law for 3 years. And so basically, if the legislature passed a law, the king could say, no, I'm going to suspend it for 3 years, and then it would have to be passed again by another legislature 3 years later. And the assumption here is that the king could then say, well, if we happen to have some sort of freak election in the National Assembly where you get a bunch of radicals and they propose some radical laws, I can stop them from doing that, and then I can wait for another election, and people can see what this group did, and if they want to re-elect them, then that group can pass those laws again. But if they don't like the laws, they don't have to re-elect those deputies, and then the new legislature will not ratify those laws that the king suspended. And so this gives the king some power, but not nearly as much. Okay. Now, at the same time that all this is happening, you remember that the background for all this is that there were food shortages in France. Right? There was this horrible hailstorm in 1788. There was this deal with England that allowed French grain to be sold in England if they could pay more. The government had been allowing grain prices to float on the market, and they had gone up and up. And you recall that, there were times when the price of bread was so high that workers in Paris were spending maybe 90% of their income on bread. And so the population of Paris is still feeling like this is a crisis for them, right? They can't eat. Well, by late August of 1789, you had the Great Fear. Everyone was worried about the harvest, right? And it turns out the harvest was actually okay that year. But by September, the harvest is coming in, but there's actually another situation. It had been a really dry summer, and a lot of the rivers were so low that you couldn't pass barges through them because the water was too shallow. And so lots of places were having food shortages, not because there wasn't food, but because they couldn't get barges of grain into the cities where they would buy it because they simply couldn't move it very well on these low rivers. So you began to see food prices creep up again in a lot of places, and a lot of people are starting to get really, really scared about this. Well, in the middle of this, another sort of event and a rumor happens. On September 14th, Louis XVI decides to bring a regiment of soldiers called the Flanders Regiment to Versailles and to guard the king's palace and the king's household. The king is still living in Versailles, which again is like 15 miles outside Paris. And so he basically he's thought a lot about what's going on in Paris with the Bastille, etc. He thinks crowds in Paris are really dangerous, And so he says, I want to head that off. And he hears about, there's unrest about bread prices in Paris. He realizes that people are getting kind of skittish here. And so he decides to bring in the Flanders Regiment to prevent any violence, right? It's going to protect him. Well, the Flanders Regiment has a dinner. And at the dinner, the rumors start to swirl that at the dinner, the Flanders Regiment had actually drunk a whole bunch of toasts, but none of them were to the Revolution or to the National Assembly or anything like that. And in fact, they had taken a cockade, which is a red, white, and blue hat that was symbolized the Revolution, thrown on the ground, or not a hat, but a button, and they had thrown on the ground and stomped on it, right? So they were basically just saying, we don't support the Revolution. Well, those rumors start swirling. People are like, oh, well, this is really offensive. The king's men don't like the Revolution. Well, Louis also issues a letter, and it's possible that he issued the letter because he had the Flanders Regiment now, and he was feeling like now that he had these soldiers around him, he could be more aggressive. But he issues a letter saying, you know what? He doesn't like the suspensive veto after all, and he will only agree to a constitution that gives him a full veto. He also says that he does not like the decree abolishing feudal privileges. He says he doesn't agree to that. And then he adds an extra letter, just to make sure, saying he doesn't accept the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen either. And so he's essentially saying, I don't accept that, I don't accept that, and I don't like your the preliminary things you've done for the Constitution. So he's basically rejecting everything the National Assembly has done, and he's saying, I'm not on board with any of it. Well, this leads, the sort of anger about this builds through the last half of September. And the rumors get a little more outlandish, a little more outlandish. Rumors tend to get a little more, they get embellished as people tell them. And so the rumors just got more and more embellished. And finally, by October 5th or 6th, people in Paris were really furious with the king. And bread prices were still really high. And the two things came together on October 5th. Now, we know that some of this was sort of planned, and I'll talk about some of the groups later, but there's a club called the Cordelier Club, and one of the leaders of the Cordelier Club was a guy named Camille Desmoulins. And I talked about him before. He was actually, he was like a down-and-out intellectual before the Revolution. He'd been part of the Grub Street Enlightenment, one of those hack writers trying to make a living. He now had become a pretty good orator, and he used to give these speeches at the Palais Royal, which was officially a palace in Paris owned by the brother of the king, but it had an open courtyard, and it was sort of the kind of place where the public just hung out there. And you used to have, there used to be prostitutes hanging out there, but there would also be, jugglers and vendors and stuff like that. And it was sort of a place that people used to just go and hang out. And it kind of had a seedy reputation because of that. Well, Desmoulins used to go there, and he used to talk a lot and give speeches about politics and things like that. Well, Desmoulins and some other ones on October 5th began to really hit hard on the idea that the grain prices, the bread prices were high, not because there was an actual shortage, but because the king wasn't doing anything about it. There was hoarding going on, and the king wasn't doing anything about it. Well, for various reasons, it's really kind of shady, we're not sure. But basically, traditionally in Europe, if bread prices get too high, it's actually women who start to riot about it, because women were expected to buy the food, and women were the ones standing in line at the bakeries. And if the prices got too high or there were shortages, it was the women who got angry about it, and so this on October 5th, sort of bread riot starts as people start to demand lower bread prices, and they refuse to pay the high prices, etc. And orators like Desmoulins convince a bunch of women that they should go and petition the king. And so late in the afternoon on October 5th, about 7,000 women, they gather together, these 7,000 women have all sorts of makeshift weapons, rakes and sticks and brooms and whatever they can get their hands on, kitchen knives, and they even take a couple of cannons. They find some soldiers who will give them some cannons, and they pull these cannons and they march out to Versailles, right? It takes 3 hours to march there, 5 hours. So they get there fairly late in the evening. But these 7,000 angry women show up at Versailles demanding that the king do something at bread prices. Well, the first place they go is they actually go and talk to the National Assembly. And the National Assembly is like, hey, you do whatever you want. Great, go talk to the king. Go talk to the king. Now, what's kind of interesting is the 7,000 women take off for Versailles. Well, Lafayette and the National Guard hear about this. Remember, the National Guard was this new sort of military force that had been put together by volunteers, mostly middle-class volunteers, and it was headed by Lafayette, who was this wealthy aristocrat, but he was sort of the hero of the American Revolution in French eyes. And so Lafayette is like, well, you know, I'm not here to protect Versailles. I'm supposed to maintain order in Paris. But his men said, no, the king's in danger. You've got to go. And they actually threatened to lynch Lafayette unless he led the National Guard to Versailles to protect the king. So Lafayette and his 20,000 National Guardsmen take off several hours later after the women, right? And they're also marching, and it takes them hours, and they don't get there till midnight. So they get to Versailles also, but basically the women get there pretty close to dark, and so they just sort of sit down and camp out on the lawn outside of Versailles. And Lafayette's men show up like well after midnight, and they sort of just camp out on the lawn. And so nobody knows what's going to happen, right? Well then, on the morning of October 6th, early in the morning, a bunch of the women approach the guards at the palace. These were Swiss guards at the palace at this point, and the Swiss guards were Swiss mercenaries, basically. And they approach the Swiss guards who were guarding the door to the palace, and they say, we want to go in and talk to the king. And the guard's like, no, you can't go talk to the king. And they say, we demand to talk to the king, and things escalate. And to make a long story short, the women grab the Swiss guards, and they pull them, they literally rip them to pieces, cut off their heads, and break into the palace. And what happens then is that you get this sort of mad rush of all these women are rushing into the palace because they want to. They're just rushing through the hallways to the palace, and they're attacking, or anybody. Or some of them are just running in there to see the palace. Some of them are running in there because they want to petition the king and ask him questions. Some are running in there because they're angry now and they want to kill people. And then Lafayette and all of his National Guards like, oh my gosh, they're storming the palace, and they go rushing into the palace. And so you get this mad scramble of thousands and thousands of people are just running through the halls of the palace. And in fact, Marie Antoinette is asleep in her bed with her kids, and a group of women break into her bedroom and screaming and shouting at her, and she runs into another room and locks the door, but she's almost just attacked by the mob. And then they break into the king's rooms, and they come up on the king. Well, by the time the crowd found where the king's chambers were, Lafayette had already gone to the king's chambers, and so Lafayette is there with the king, and the crowd is trying to break into the room to basically confront the king, and who knows what, violence. But Lafayette is thinking very quickly, so what he does is there's a balcony on the king's bedroom, and so he shoves the king out onto the balcony and then locks the door, so that when the women break into the king's chambers, there's a locked door between them and the king. But Lafayette has shoved the king out onto the balcony, and there's all sorts of women outside also. And so the women outside begin to shout at the king and demand that he do something about bread prices and et cetera. And Lafayette goes out there with the king, and eventually the king says, okay, here's what I'll do. He says, I've got several wagon loads of grain. I'll bring that back to Paris, and we'll distribute it for free. And he says, and then I will address bread prices. And so the women say, okay, you have to come back to Paris with us, and you got to bring your wife and kids, and you're going to take up residence in Paris so that you can really address grain prices. And so what happens then, this all happens in the morning of October 6th, what happens then is this huge procession. You've got the 20,000 National Guardmen, you've got about 8,000, 7,000 women, but then more have come during the night, so we don't know the exact number, 10,000 people from Paris, and then the king brings his whole household from Versailles back to Paris with him. So there's thousands of servants and others who show up. And some estimates are that it was by this point, and more people come out on October 6th too from Paris because they hear what's going on, they want to see it. One estimate is that maybe 60,000 people now march from Versailles back to Paris. And it's this huge procession, and the king is there in his carriage with his wife and his kids. And it's really, there's a threat here. I mean, everybody's armed. The National Guardsmen are there to protect the king, but everybody sees how angry the women are. Nobody's sure it's really tense. But the women start singing on the way back, and they make up a song about the baker and the baker's wife and the baker's kids are coming back to Paris to bring bread to everybody. And they basically bring Louis back to Paris, and they stick him in, there's a palace in Paris. It's it was where the Louvre is now, you know, the glass pyramid, the Iampe pyramid at the Louvre Museum in Paris. It's right, it would have been right in front of that. It was a palace called the Tuileries, right? And it was a palace, but it had not been used by the king in a long time. It had, you know, the furniture was really old, the wallpaper was really old, the decorations were, you know, the family hadn't lived there in I don't know how many decades. But the crowd sticks Louis into the Tuileries and says, "You got to stay here." So Louis and his family actually spent a really uncomfortable night there because nobody was ready for them at the Tuileries. Nobody's expecting them, but there they are all of a sudden, and there's like no food, there's no bedding, there's no, there's no, very little firewood. So they spent a really cold, uncomfortable night there. And Louis would actually essentially, from the October days, for the rest of his life, which is another couple of years, he would essentially be a prisoner in Paris, in his own house. He would be a prisoner in the Tuileries, and then later we'll see he's actually a prisoner in the temple. But he is basically stuck there. He cannot leave. If he tries to leave, crowds of people show up, and rumors fly that he's trying to leave, and crowds of people show up and won't let his carriage pass. And so he's basically just sort of held hostage there. Technically, he's still running the country. Technically, he's still king of France. And he still has a lot of clout, and a lot of people come and meet him and talk to him, and etc. But he can't leave, right? And his family can't leave. All right. So, one final thing. Once the king has moved from Versailles to the Tuileries in Paris, the National Assembly follows suit. And they actually go from the king's tennis court, actually we're back in the meeting hall in Versailles. They now go to Paris, and right across the sort of courtyard from the Tuileries, there is a riding school called the Manège, and it's got the big sort of oval riding area with the dirt floor for horses to practice on, and then it's got a bunch of bleachers on each side. So the National Assembly takes over the Manège, and so they're right across from the king's house at the Tuileries, but now the center of government has moved to Paris proper. And this means that, and we'll see, that this means that the threat of the popular violence is always there. Now, we saw popular violence erupt with the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille. We've seen popular violence erupt with the October days. And in both cases, this was really the lower classes of Paris who were engaging in this sort of violence. Right? And so basically this is, Lefebvre in his Marxist interpretation says that, by the time the October days has happened, you now have 4 distinct social classes involved in a class struggle from the Marxist point of view. You've got the aristocrats coupled with the upper reaches of the church who are trying to defend their noble privileges, their economic position at the top of society, their control of the government. And the king is sort of representing the aristocratic class now. Although, Lefebvre says the thing that started the revolution was this fight between the king and the aristocrats with the Assembly of Notables and whatever that led to the calling of the Estates General. So the initial fight for the French Revolution, according to the Marxist view, was that the aristocrats and the king started to fight over power. And nobody expected that to escape from their control. But with the National Assembly, the bourgeoisie, the urban elites, who were wealthy doctors, lawyers, etc., but were not at aristocratic levels, they enter the field. So now this is the second class. You've got the aristocrats on the one hand, you've got the urban bourgeoisie on the second hand part, and they're the members of the National Assembly, right? Then, Lefebvre says, you've got the working classes of Paris who storm the Bastille and who carry out the October days, and they are a different class. They are poor, they're urban, and they have their own class interests. They have things that they want to have happen. In particular, they want bread prices to come down. They want better income, more equality, etc. And we'll talk more about that later. But they have a specific set of interests because of their class. And then the fourth class, according to Lefebvre, is the peasants, who have their own interests, which is they want their own land, they want to end seigneurial privileges, etc. So it's really a 4-class conflict, according to the Marxists. Right, that you've got the aristocracy trying to hold on to their privileges and their control of the country. You've got the bourgeoisie challenging them from the National Assembly. You've got the urban working class challenging them with violence in the streets. And then you have the peasants challenging them with violence through the Great Fear. right? And so each class has their own agenda, what they want. And each class is working towards what they want, and sometimes they want the same things and sometimes they don't. And so for the Marxists, the real way to understand the revolution from this point onward is this multi-sided struggle, this tug of war between the aristocrats on one hand, the bourgeoisie on the other, the urban working class on the third, and the peasantry on the fourth. All right. Now, the National Assembly now is back in Paris. And they still have a problem. They still have a problem that they've had for quite a while, which is, what do they do about the French national debt? Because they don't think of themselves as a totally new government. They think they are the French government, and the French government has all this debt. So how are they going to pay it back, right? And so the National Assembly comes up with a plan, and they enact a number of things over late 1789 and early 1790. And they basically, what they do is they nationalize the church. And what that means is that they pass a law that says that the French government is going to seize all the land owned by the Catholic Church in France. And this is a significant chunk of land, a significant percentage of all the land in France, because they seize every monastery, they seize every church, they seize every piece of land owned by the church. They seize all of it. And they nationalize it. They say it belongs to the French government now. And they don't ask the Pope about this. The Pope is not happy. But then, what do you do with all the priests and monks, etc.? Well, they decree that all the parish priests and bishops and archbishops are now employees of the French government, right? And so the French government will pay salaries going down the road, but the French government is taking all the land that had previously provided the income for bishops and archbishops, etc. Now, this leads to a couple other things. Number one is that in early 1790, the National Assembly decides to abolish all the monastic orders. They basically say to all the monks and nuns, everyone in France, you're out of here. And they basically just kick them out of their monasteries and just kick them out and seize the monasteries. Okay. But the second thing they do, which turns out to be a bit dicey, is they issue a bunch of bonds, government bonds called assignats. And they basically say, this is a bond which is, we're using this to pay our debts, and it's basically a claim on a certain percentage of the land that we've seized from the church, right? But these assignats begin to circulate as money, and eventually the National Assembly would just make them money, right? And so essentially the National Assembly has now issued a new form of money. And it's backed by this church land initially. So if you look overall at the first year of the revolution, there's been a number of things that happen. First of all, you have the creation of the National Assembly. Second of all, the National Assembly sits down and starts to write a constitution, a new constitution. It's going to be a monarchy, but it's going to be a constitutional monarchy with specific powers for the king and the legislature, etc. Then they abolished all noble privileges, right? And they said everybody's equal before the law. They issued the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which basically says everyone's equal before the law. And then the king is sort of brought back to Paris under threat of violence, and then they nationalize the church. The government seizes control of the church. Now, for a lot of people in the National Assembly, they haven't finished the Constitution yet, but for a lot of people in the National Assembly, by the summer of 1790, 1 year into the French Revolution, a lot of people in the National Assembly say, hey, we've pretty much done here. We've fixed everything we want to fix. Because for them, upper middle class people who have, doctors and lawyer types and who are fairly wealthy, they're not too interested in fixing bread prices. Because that doesn't bother them. That's not one of their things that bothers them. And they're not too interested in rich. But they definitely wanted to get rid of noble privilege. They definitely wanted to get rid of all the systematic advantages that nobles had. And they want to get rid of, and they actually abolish titles of nobility. You can still claim you're the count or whatever, but it has no legal meaning anymore because it doesn't mean anything. And so they've abolished nobility and aristocracy, and they've made everyone equal before the law, and they basically see the revolution as done now. They fixed everything they want to fix, right? And so, in July of 1790, on the anniversary of the Bastille, fall of Bastille, they have the Fête de la Fédération, which is the festival of the Federation. And they're basically patting themselves on the back. Hey, look, we've carried out a revolution. We've done everything we wanted to do. We're going to issue a new constitution soon. It would actually take more than a year, but we're going to issue a new constitution and then we'll be done. The revolution will be over, right? And so if you look at France and at the Fête de la Fédération, it looked pretty much like things were on track to be all wrapped up as soon as that constitution was done, and everything was going to be over, right? So given that, I just want to finish up by talking about a couple of groups that a couple of factors in the revolution. They're going to become more important as we go along. They were sort of important so far. They would get much more important. The first is I want to talk about the clubs. Now, I mentioned previously that this one group of members of the National Assembly that had formed the Breton Club. They got together and they talk about what they want to do, and they sort of became a political faction, a political party, if you will. Well, once the king had been brought back to Paris in the October days and the National Assembly had moved back to Paris, the Breton Club decided to take over a Jacobin monastery. Jacobin was a monastic order. They take over a Jacobin monastery right across the street from the Manège, and they make that their headquarters, and they open a club, and everyone, their official title was the Friends of the Constitution, but everyone called them the Jacobin Club. And so the Jacobin Club is a private club. You actually have to pay dues to get in, but the dues are set pretty low. But basically, the club is just a place. They have a clubhouse. You go there, and people would go there and have political debates. And so the members of the National Assembly would, during the day, they'd be at the National Assembly arguing about laws and what have you. But then at night, they might go to the Jacobin Club, and they would debate things, and they would decide as a group sort of what they wanted to be doing, what were good ideas. And because the entrance fee for the Jacobin Club was fairly low, lots of the public just came in. You could just pay for admission for one night. And so lots of people would just go to the Jacobin Club to listen to debates and things. And over time, what we're going to see is that the Jacobin Club becomes the center of really radical agitation in the revolution. That the members of the National Assembly who are part of the Jacobin Club take their cues from the other members of the Jacobin Club, and the sort of radical ideas get debated there and then brought back to the National Assembly and get put into action. And eventually the Jacobin Club would also start to use the people in the street and street violence to their advantage, right? So the Jacobin Club becomes this really key political factor in the revolution, and it's radical. It's constantly pushing to go more and more and more. A second club is very similar. It's called the Cordelier Club. And the Cordelier Club is actually on the left bank, on the south bank of the Seine River in Paris. The Jacobin Club's on the right bank or the north bank. The Cordelier Club was also taken over a monastery. The Cordelier Club had a lower price of admission, so it had a little lower class membership. But the Cordelier Club also becomes this place where people debate every night, and big crowds show up, and people give speeches about laws, etc. The Cordelier Club is not as closely connected to the National Assembly. It doesn't have National Assembly members, as many who come to the Cordelier Club every night. The Jacobin Club is really, the core of the Jacobin Club is members of the National Assembly who come back to the Jacobin Club every night to debate things. The Cordelier Club is more the public debating things. And we'll see that a lot of the really radical revolutionaries like Danton and Desmoulins and others are going to come out of the Cordelier Club. Okay, so we want to keep track of these two clubs, the Cordelier Club and the Jacobin Club. And there were dozens of other clubs too that weren't as influential. The second group I want to talk about is the sections. Now, when the king announced in 1788 they were going to have elections for the Estates General, in Paris, they had divided Paris up into a bunch of what they called sections, and we would call them today voting precincts. And so each section had a voting station where people would go to vote in their neighborhood. But people used to hang out there, and they would talk about politics and things. And so each section in Paris became a sort of a political center. And because the sections were not private clubs or anything, anybody could go there. And so really the lower classes of Paris were going to the sections, and they'd hear rumors and they'd talk about the news and all of that. And we'll see that the sections become these sort of centers of popular agitation, that the crowds of Paris would get organized and worked up at the sections and then march out to do violence at various points in the revolution. So these sections are an important part of the revolution. They're part of the machinery of violence in the revolution. They're where the foot soldiers come from, the street crowds. So the sections are generally dominated by the lower classes, right? And the last thing I want to talk about is the sans-culottes. The sans-culottes, basically this is a name for the people of Paris, the poor of Paris. And the sans-culottes, the actual reference is to, culottes are knee breeches. They're men's pants that stop right below the knee. And essentially, this is what aristocrats wore. And culottes were a sign of wealth because if your pants only go below the knee, then your calves have to be covered with silk stockings, right? Which are really expensive. And silk stockings are really easy to damage and stain. And the streets of Paris were full of dust and horse manure and garbage and dead animals and sewage. And so if you're walking in the streets of Paris and you're wearing silk stockings, you're going to ruin them in no time flat. So the only way you could afford to wear silk stockings was if you're riding around in a carriage or on a horse or something, which means it's an upper class thing. So short knee breeches or culottes are a sign of being wealthy and upper class because they go with silk stockings. Well, the people of Paris call themselves the sans-culottes, the ones who don't have culottes. They have long pants or skirts. And so the sans-culottes were sort of proud of the fact they couldn't afford silk stockings and culottes. But the sans-culottes then become the sort of the people of Paris, the lower classes of Paris, and they are really the ones who carry out the violence during the October days, etc. They're the ones who get organized by the sections, and eventually we'll see that the Jacobin Club and the Cordelier Club try to use the sans-culottes as their foot soldiers. So all these are sort of the levels and groups that are agitated and brought into the political process by the early year of the French Revolution. And so by the end of that year, it looks like things are calming down, that all the radical things have been done, because the members of the National Assembly think, well, we're pretty much done here. We just got to finish up the Constitution and we're done. But the clubs, the sections, the sans-culottes, they're just getting started because they expected more from the revolution. They want low-priced bread. They want jobs. They have all sorts of demands for their lives, and they're going to start asking for that. And the National Assembly will now have to decide if they're going to give them that. And that takes up the next part of the French Revolution.